My name is Warwick Lightfoot. I'm the Director of Research and the Head of Economics and Social Policy here at Policy Exchange. And most of my working life has been spent as a professional economist. And I think it's fair to say that there are about 3 areas of public policy that all economists should know more about. They should know more about taxation, about competition policy and the structure of labour markets and product markets, and they should know more about trade itself. But for many years, if you were a British economist, investing a lot of intellectual effort into examining trade and all its intricacies and what an optimal trade policy would be was largely otiose, because that was a matter that was reserved to our partners within the EU through the single market and its common external tariff. This time last year, that changed. And we were very grateful at Policy Exchange to have the assistance of the Australian High Commissioner, Alexander Downer, Sir Lockwood Smith, the New Zealand High Commissioner, and Dr. Geoff Raby, who's sitting there, who actually came to join us to think about what the opportunities could be for the United Kingdom and what a sensible policy could be outside of the EU. And we realised that we were going to have to change our thinking, develop our thinking, and we were absolutely delighted when Geoff Raby agreed to lead that work and become head of our trade unit, which he's done effectively since July, August last year. As we move into the detailed negotiations and discussions about the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, we thought it was worth sitting down for an hour or so and thinking about what would British trade policy be if we could develop an optimal trade policy. And really this morning's seminar is, and we're going to have to get through quite a lot to actually accomplish what I hope we're going to do, is to address those kind of questions. So Geoff Raby will lead our discussions, our keynote speaker and head of our trade policy unit, but he's going to be joined by another in-house Policy Exchange speaker, which is Dr. Graham Gudgin, who is our recently appointed Chief Economic Advisor, and he's going to be presenting a paper on gravity trade models. You can tell my age. I have it in paper, it's electronically available, and of course, for me, it's bound in Treasury tags. So Graham will take us through that very important discussion that relates to how one assesses the efficacy and importance of the single market itself. And we've been joined by an outside team to mark our homework, so to speak. And Peter Lilley, a former Treasury Minister who I worked for many years ago, and former Trade Minister will help us. And Alexander Downer, the Australian High Commissioner, who did so much to actually get us to think about these issues properly last year, will also speak. And I'm delighted that Nicky Morgan has joined us. She's also got to actually go I think she's on a deadline, so she may be slipping away. But we're very grateful for Nicky coming to join us, because it's important. Economists have one view of these things. What politicians will do is another. And she also has the great advantage, unlike certainly myself, in that she's a lawyer and was a lawyer before she became a politician. And I've slowly learnt over the last year there are 2 big stories going on. It's economics and it's law in trade. Now, before we get going on the substance of it, I'm going to own up to the fact that the economists at Policy Exchange have increasingly become aware of the fact in all our work on farm policy, industrial policy, competition policy, that a liberal trade regime is at the heart of making progress. And trade is not about finding some way to flog your stuff to somebody else halfway around the world. It is about exposing your domestic labour and product markets to greater competition. And that in this year, the 200th anniversary of the publication of David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, that's still probably one of the most powerful intellectual tools in the apparatus that economists bring to public discussion is the principle of comparative advantage. And I'm very much looking forward to Geoff taking us through what he sees the opportunities and the practical way forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Warwick. It's great to be back at Policy Exchange. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Yes, it's almost exactly a year since I gave a keynote presentation here, only some weeks after the Brexit vote, and it felt as if everyone was shell-shocked, and they probably were at the time. And I had a message, I think, of a positive message, a message of hope, a very pragmatic, I think, way forward for the United Kingdom, and I think that still stands as true today as it did 12 months ago. In 12 months, and I'm an outside observer, and sadly I haven't been back since then. I would like to come back more often. Some things have happened. There's been legislation through the Parliament about Brexit. There's been an election recently where Brexit, in my view, reading it from afar, wasn't really a major issue in the polling. There's been, I think, importantly, an acceptance of the fact that the UK will no longer be in the single market. That's because of inability to sign on to the four freedoms, particularly the freedom of movement of people, and unwillingness to subject the UK to the jurisdiction of the European Court. So that clears things up. Last year there was still a lot of talk about single market or not. What I come back to the UK and find today is that there's a lot of talk about transition and policies of transition. And I'd like to say a little bit about that, because what does transition actually mean? In the trade area, there may be other areas where it has more substance. In the trade area, it effectively means remaining in the customs union. And in a recent policy exchange paper, I described the customs union as a soft option with a dead end. What you get with the customs union is, in effect, the worst of all possible worlds. You don't have control over your trade policy. You're still subject to the Brussels Common External Tariff. Tariffs can be raised or lowered at the whim of Brussels, and it only covers goods. The UK's greatest strength, of course, is in services trade, and I should say the fact that the UK will leave the single market will have some implications, adverse implications for services trade, particularly in the area of passporting, although that, in my view, is much exaggerated in terms of its negative impact. But a customs union is only about goods, and it's often neglected the fact that in the last 10 years, the EU, continental Europe, I should say, has been a falling source of markets for UK goods exports. 10 years ago, UK exported about 60% of its goods to the EU. Today it's down to 40%, and that's because growth has been so anemic in the EU over the past decade, whilst the rest of the world has been so dynamic and been growing so rapidly. So, as I said, the customs union is the worst of all possible outcomes, and it also denies the UK the opportunity of exploring alternative trade policy arrangements, particularly FTAs with other trading partners. There's also a lot of talk, and this is also in the context, I think, of the transition argument, which I see as a cover for keeping the UK in the customs union. A lot of talk about if you don't have the customs union, if there's no deal, then you fall off a cliff. Well, there is no cliff. If there's no deal, there's the WTO. And it seems to be something of a surprise to many people in the UK that the rest of the world happily, profitably and successfully trades with the EU based on WTO obligations, rules and MFN tariff rates. And that's what the UK would revert to. The good news is that when you look at what might happen with UK-EU trade under WTO, EU MFN tariffs in the WTO are actually quite low. So autos is often cited as a sector, but that's 4% tariff into the EU. It doesn't matter, and given the 10% plus depreciation in the pound exchange rate since Brexit, those sorts of tariffs are swamped by movements in exchange rates. And you could expect further movements in exchange rates which would further offset the tariffs. So it's actually not a cliff at all trading with the WTO if that's all that the UK can do. But I'm actually, and I've written about this a lot in PE, very optimistic that the UK and EU can strike a comprehensive, high-level, liberalising bilateral free trade agreement. A couple of reasons for that. One, there's never been two economies more deeply integrated to sit down at the table and negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement. There is, for 43 years, been no tariffs. The UK signed on to the EU acquis. The area that holds up most FTA bilateral negotiations happens to be in the area of regulatory arrangements, behind the border measures. Well, because the UK is part of the EU acquis, that doesn't arise as an obstacle. And it scarcely seems credible that negotiators are going to sit down opposite each other at the table to negotiate higher tariffs against each other. It simply doesn't make sense. And if you think that's too obvious to be worth stating, remember this, that the EU sells twice as much to the UK than the UK sells to the EU. The EU has real economic and commercial interest in negotiating a bilateral FTA with the UK. So I'm confident that can happen, and I'm confident that can happen within the 2-year time frame of the Article 50 exit arrangements. Finally, though, just looking beyond WTO and a UK-EU FTA, there is a possibility now outside the customs union for the UK to negotiate bilateral FTAs with anyone they wish to do so in the world. Just to quickly end at this point, we come back to in questions. You've got a bunch of countries, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Deputy High Commissioners in the room here, and Chile, who are very open, very liberal, and already have a lot of comprehensive bilateral FTAs with other parties. And they could negotiate FTAs with the UK very, very quickly, assuming the UK's got the negotiating capacity in place. And then you've got other markets which are much bigger, obviously much more attractive targets because of their size, but where negotiations would be more complicated. But the group I would have on my list would be Japan, South Korea, probably China, and then the United States in that sort of order, although there are compelling geopolitical reasons for the UK to want to do an early bilateral FTA with the United States. So, Warwick, at that point, I'll leave it, but happy to come back to it in Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, I'm going to ask Graham to talk about this paper that we're presenting. Since I first came to Policy Exchange about a year ago, I've been very keen that we should actually have a substantive piece published on the gravity trade models. They played a very significant part in shaping, certainly the official assessment of the significance of the single market to the UK economy during the referendum debate last year. They first emerged in British public policy discussion as part of the work the Treasury did to assess the merits or demerits of the United Kingdom participating in the single currency, which Gordon Brown commissioned about 15 years ago. And it was very striking that the Shadow Chancellor at the time, Michael Howard, pointed out on the floor of the House of Commons that you might be careful about drawing too much from data and inferences from countries like Malawi. And Graham has done a lot of work on this and is unusually well placed to pursue the matter. And saving his blushes, I would just say this, that he and his collaborator Ken Coates, many years ago, actually worked with the late Wing Godley. Wing Godley was the very important Treasury economist who moved to Cambridge, and in the Department of Applied Economics, really more than any other econometrician or group of econometricians, attempted to create an international sector looking at the capital account and the current account to buttress the Keynesian, often closed economy models at that time. And they really were the John the Baptist figures in this area. So, Graham, we're much looking forward to you giving us an in-the-face description of this rather complicated analysis.
Thank you very much, Warwick. Although I never recalled John the Baptist before. But thank you for those kind words about Wing Godley, who is one of the heroes of economic policy in the UK, I think. My co-author Ken Coates, who's in the audience here, and myself really came at this because we didn't believe, we didn't speak. Shall I stand up as well? That might be.
Is microphone working?
Ah.
Yes.
It should work if I touch it. Can you hear me at the back?
Yeah. Don't be shy. Yeah.
Rather right, I'll shout as loud as I can. Ken Coates and I came at this really because we didn't believe the official reports, and it's taken us several months of work to work out exactly why we don't believe it and what we think is wrong. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to follow Geoff Raby, who I think has very succinctly announced all of our conclusions, really. And I'm so pleased that someone with real experience in this area has the same views as we've rather laboured to come towards. Our view is that negotiating tactics in the current Brexit negotiations really depend very much on what you expect the economic outcome to be. If, like Peter Mandelson, you expect no deal to be what he calls, to quote, a catastrophic disaster, never use one word when two will do, I think. If you expect that, then you're going to have to make lots of concessions to avoid such a bad outcome. If you expect a pretty benign outcome, you can push a harder deal. Now, the main evidence base, I think, for most people in this who particularly believe that no deal will be some sort of disaster, comes from 3 reports published, two by the Treasury, one from OECD and one from IMF, all published pretty well in the same week during the referendum campaign in May 2016. Most of this evidence in these reports was actually ignored, I think, by most Leave voters who just don't trust economists. Ken and I would say perhaps for good reason in some cases. They got the short term wrong, but the long term forecasts of perhaps something short of economic disaster, but a pretty poor economic outlook is still widely believed. So today's policy exchange report does 3 things. It outlines the approach taken in each of these official reports. Firstly, trying to estimate what the advantage of membership of the European Union is to trade, how much more trade you do if you're a member with other members, how much extra foreign direct investment, FDI, you get, knock-on effects in productivity, and they put their estimates of these things into a macro model and come out with a result, which I'll talk about in a sec. The second thing we do in the report is to try and demystify these gravity models, which is really the brief that Warwick gave us. Almost impossible for the general public to understand exactly how the Treasury and others reached the conclusions they did. So we've tried to do some demystification. And thirdly, I think that the main work we did, and this really did take us a long time and a lot of data, we reproduced the gravity model, particularly that of the Treasury, to check its accuracy and appropriateness. Now, the gravity model, by analogy with Newtonian physics, just says the amount of trade between 2 countries will depend on the size of the 2 economies and inversely with the distance apart. So we should do rather less trade with a country like Australia because it's a long way away than we do with a nearer country of the same size. That's the general idea. What you do is get all the data for all the trade in the world, work out a sort of baseline relationship, and then calculate how much extra trade is being done by those countries which are members of the EU. Fairly simple idea really, although economists in their usual way try and make it as complicated as they can. What we found when we looked at this was that the measured impact from a gravity model, the impact on trade, is pretty variable. It depends on which countries are included. This is the point that Warwick was just making. It depends on the time period you take, and it depends on the precise methods you use. You can use different varieties of gravity model. Now the Treasury assumed, they worked out this impact. They worked out that in fact being a member of the EU increases your trade with other EU members by 115%. Essentially it doubles it, within twice as much trade as you would with non-members of the EU. And they assumed that if the UK leaves, it will lose most of that, or in an extreme case, it will lose all of that trade. And the Treasury also assumed there will be no replacement. Although they said the statistics showed that we didn't lose any trade with anybody else when we went in, and we probably won't gain any when we come out. I think Australians and New Zealanders would have something to say about that. But, anyway, that was the Treasury's view of this. Then these reports do 3 things which we would be very critical of, and which in each case I think greatly exaggerate the potential impact of EU membership. The really big one was this doubling of trade they worked out was an average across all 28 EU countries. If you look at the UK specifically, as we did, you find a much lower impact, something like 25% rather than 115%. We originally thought that was something of an oversight, but we've subsequently seen an earlier Treasury paper which showed that they did actually know this, but for some reason decided to omit it from their 200-page report on the long-term impact. Secondly, the point Geoff Raby was making, there's no account in here of sterling depreciation. So the average tariff is 4 or 5%, depending on how you weight it. sterling depreciation of 10 to 15% should offset that for the great majority of companies. But it won't offset it for all, because you get very high tariffs in dairying, meat production, some other agricultural products. But the third thing, again, a point that Geoff made, these reports take no account of the slow growth of EU markets. And in fact, the proportion of UK exports going to the EU has been falling fast now for 10 or 15 years. And Oxford Economics, and Adam Slater is in the audience who did this work, worked out that it'll probably fall to about 30% anyway, even if we stayed in the EU. So the loss that the Treasury are predicting, Oxford Economics think would happen anyway, just because of this slow growth factor. So 3 quite big emissions there. If you take those into account, you get a much smaller impact. I'll leave it to you to decide whether there's an issue of civil service integrity in this. We'll just talk about the actual issues. So the bottom line for the Treasury in this case, and slightly more favourable for the OECD and IMF, but for the Treasury, no deal would lead to a loss of somewhere between 5 and 10%, 9.5% of GDP by 2030, and a loss of up to £6,600 per household. It was that sort of figure that I think called forth a lot of derision when they were announced, that they can tell you exactly what you would lose in 14 years' time or have lost. Our estimate, it's not actually in the report, but it is in the technical reports which are associated with it, which include a little bit of monetary and fiscal easing, much of which is already underway, is we may, as a worst case, we may get a loss of GDP, perhaps 2% by 2025, but after that things should start improving, and by 2030, the Treasury's date, we think the UK would actually be in credit, would actually have a gain from leaving the EU rather than a loss. These things are quite arguable. It depends what you put in the model. One of our key assumptions, for instance, was that it would take 20 years to replace any lost trade from the EU through new free trade agreements. We thought that was a pretty cautious and pessimistic assumption, but we just put it in to err on the side of caution. And Geoff may have much more intelligent things to say about that than we could. But if our firms do find new markets more quickly, then the outcome would be even better than we suggest. But our bottom line is really, there's not a great deal to worry about in this. We're not fighting the Napoleonic Wars again. And compared to the impact of the banking collapse in 2009, this is really a rather small issue in economic terms.
Yeah. Graham, thank you very much. Yes, I think that certainly Policy Exchange shares Graham's view that Brexit is very important. It's very important in constitutional terms, but there are other very important things as well, not least monetary and fiscal policy we have to keep an eye on, which neatly brings us on to Mr. Peter Lilley.
All right. My claim to fame in this respect is that I was, until the 3rd of May, the only serving Member of Parliament who's ever been involved in negotiating a trade deal in the UK, namely the Uruguay round, and B, who, as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, had to introduce the so-called internal market programme, or what people wrongly call the single market programme, in 1992, or leading up to 1992. I'm also comparatively unusual in the House of Commons in that I was, before studying economics, I was trained as a scientist. And scientists have this quaint habit that you make a prediction and then you see whether it comes out true. And if it doesn't come out true, you know the theory on which you made your prediction was wrong. It's very simple. You've got to change your theory. That's what Feynman, the greatest physicist of the last century, said, or last half of the last century said. As Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, when I was involved in the Uruguay round, I made lots of hyperbolic speeches about how beneficial it was. I still think it was good and beneficial. But looking back subsequently, I found the impact on world trade was far smaller, more gradual and harder to detect than I had predicted beforehand. So it was a good thing to reduce tariffs to an average level among developed countries of about 4%, about 2.5% on industrial products. It had a gradual, beneficial, long-term effect, but not a dramatic effect. And it's therefore very unlikely that the reimposition of tariffs, where they haven't been in place as between us and the EU, will have a dramatic effect. So that was the first thing. And that doesn't sort of show up in... So when the Treasury produced their forecast during the referendum campaign, showing this massive increase in trade from the reduction of tariffs, I thought, hang on, is that what happened after the Uruguay round? And is that what happened when we joined the EU? Now, I also have the great advantage of being old. And I was there when we joined the EU. I made hyperbolic speeches then in favour of us joining because the removal of EU tariffs would dramatically increase our trade. It did increase our trade, but not dramatically. And though, as your study rightly points out, the Treasury claim that the average effect of membership of the EU is to double trade in goods and to increase in trade in services by about 25%, was it, on average?
100% on average and 25% for UK.
No, for services.
Oh, for services, 25%.
25%. Yes. So on average, it came out 76% for the UK. I just thought, well, that's not what I remember happening. I remember us joining the EU on January 1st, 73, hoping that it was going to be terrifically beneficial to the British economy. And 3.5 years later, we were bankrupt. We had to be bailed out by the IMF in the biggest bailout of a developed country that had ever taken place until Greece. So it wasn't so obvious. So when this came out, I did my own study, which wasn't nearly as good as yours, but was achieved during the referendum campaign. I published it during the referendum campaign. I sent it to the Office of National Statistics, who considered it very seriously for a while and then decided it was not their remit to decide whether the Treasury were capable of interpreting statistics, only whether they should produce them. Though the feelings I got back from some junior people at the Office of National Statistics was that the Treasury were on very dodgy ground. And subsequently, I've republished it and went back to see the government chief economic advisor. There's a story in that we were discussing beforehand. I wrote to the chief economic advisor saying, look, I've got this critique, fairly similar to that published by the Policy Exchange today, but also by other critics. Can I come and discuss it? So I wrote to the head of the civil service, the head of the Treasury, and the head of the government economic service. I got no reply, so I wrote again. I got no reply. I said, look, I'm going to publish my critique on the 27th of January. I'd like to see you before then so that you can put your point of view and I can amend it if it's wrong. I still got no reply, so I put down some parliamentary questions and I got a reply. And I did go and see them, and the government chief economic advisor is absolutely charming. It turned out he'd worked for me when I was in the Treasury, which rather took the sting out of my critique on him and said not to worry, there may have been mistakes, but we're not going to worry about that in the future. The trouble is they are worrying about it. It does still influence the Treasury's analysis. They still do believe that membership of the EU has dramatically increased our trade, and that is dramatically beneficial for our GDP. I look back to what had happened just roughly to our trade with EU countries as compared with non-EU countries of similar status in the period since we joined the EU in 1973. And our trade with non-EU countries, with EU countries has risen by 30% more than it has with non-EU countries, not by 100% more. And that's, and certainly not by, and that's, I suppose, trade in goods and services, not by 76% more. So it was dramatically, as you just have to look at the figures. There they are. There was quite a big increase in the first few years, and then our trade has risen in line with our trade with non-EU countries. So it's quite clear that I thought the Treasury hadn't bothered to look, but you say they had bothered to look, but then decided not to publish, which is criminal. So that is very worrying. They then assume that whatever the increase was, if we leave, it will be undone. Now, there are two reasons for doubting that. Firstly, there's what's known in economics as the hysteresis effect. Once you've sort of got into the habit of doing something, or because of a particular economic change, even if that economic change is reversed, the removal of tariffs is replaced by the reimposition of tariffs, it doesn't go back to zero because you've got into the habit of getting your components from Germany, or Germany's gotten the habit of getting them from Sunderland or wherever, and so it doesn't go back to zero. But secondly, the bulk of the impact on our trade with the EU came from us removing very high tariffs, which then we faced before our entry in 73. The EU then had tariffs at least twice as high as it has now. If we leave, we won't go back to what they were before we joined, but to what they are now. And the EU doesn't take that the Treasury doesn't take that into account. However, all this is comparatively minor, because one thing that struck me when I was making my hyperbolic speeches about the importance of free trade in the Uruguay round, I asked officials to calculate, supposing the Uruguay round boosts our exports by X%, what will be the effect on GDP? And even where X was a large number, they came back with the impact on GDP being a very small number. And I said, why is that? And they said, because if, say, exports increase by 10%, that doesn't increase your GDP or even your share of GDP related to exports by 10%, because the net effect on your GDP is the difference in the value added of producing goods for export compared with what the value added that would have been done if those resources had been used to satisfy the domestic market. So it's a difference in value added, and it's quite small. And all the economic calculations came out as quite small. So I said, well, that's very disappointing. I want a different answer. And there are very good reasons for giving a different answer, namely actually being open to the world, being subject to competition, may have an indirect effect on your growth in productivity, and that's one of the benefits of free trade. Now, in this report the Treasury did, they accept that actually the main impact is not the growth of trade, but any impact of openness. And they choose to measure openness as the increase in the proportion of your GDP devoted to trade. That's an arbitrary assumption. I would have thought openness is the result of all sorts of different things, like the existence of the internet and things like that make you open to ideas and so on from abroad and enable you to adapt foreign methods. But nonetheless, that's what they arbitrarily assume. So they then say, well, what should we do? Should we do a regression analysis on the rate of growth of UK GDP compared with its openness? And they quite rightly say we can't do that, because exports might grow because productivity is growing, rather than productivity growing because exports are growing. And that's a normal sort of problem you get in economics in these circumstances. So they look around for someone who's managed to do a study which avoids that, whatever it's called technically, that potential reverse causation. And they come across a study, and their whole forecast is reliant on this study. It was a study of the impact of the closure of the Suez Canal between 1956 and 1968, I think. 67. And they say that gives us a measure of what the impact on trade would be that's not caused by productivity changes. And it's all dependent on that. And when you look closely at that, you find that actually the effect of reopening the canal was much less than the effect of closing it. The effect of closing it probably was because there was a temporary shipping shortage rather than a rise in costs. So, they did their best. It's the only study they could find, but it is very dubious. And I wouldn't base my whole economic and political and constitutional future on a study of the impact of trade through the closure of the canal, the bulk of the impact being on countries around the Indian Ocean, not on the UK. It had very little effect on the UK's growth or trade, but mainly on India and East Africa. I can see you want to stop, but I'm in full stream and I will stop in a second. So it is very worrying that the government treasury is still wedded to a study which is even more flawed than your excellent study suggests. And leads them, therefore, to want us to stay in the or to sort of argue under the cover that we should remain in the customs union and the so-called single market. Incidentally, there is no such thing in European law as the single market. I take it people mean by that the European Economic Area, much derided during the referendum campaign membership of it as the Norwegian option, the worst of all possible options, said the then Foreign Secretary, the now Chancellor, because you have to accept freedom of movement, domination of the European Court, and pay an annual contribution into the EU. Now, if we leave, we not only face a comparatively minor average tariff of about 4%, but we keep the money we currently give to the EU. And 4% of the value of our exports is 6.5 billion. And the net sum we will retain from leaving is 10 billion. So we have, in effect, been paying a premium of 7% of the value of our exports in order to avoid paying tariffs of 4%. Now, that can't be a good deal. If you were a banker, it's worse than PPI and you'd be had up and being asked to pay compensation. But that's what we're being asked to do, to continue paying for the a large sum for the privilege of avoiding a small sum. And I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that's not a good deal.
Well, Peter, thank you very much indeed. You have managed in this graphic way you presented it to actually give life to the shade of the late Harry Johnson, who influenced many people on these matters. And as an Australian, I think maybe the Australian High Commissioner should carry on with the torch.
Well, this is a difficult position for me to be in because I'm a diplomat, so I have to be very careful not to take too many sides, except Australia's side. But I can, as somebody who was a member of the Australian Cabinet for nearly 12 years and in that capacity was responsible for foreign affairs and trade, speak with a bit of experience of trade agreements and variations in trade. I suppose our starting point would be 1973. The UK must have been in those days our second largest trading partner, joined the European Union, or the common market as we used to call it in those days, and a whole lot of our exports were simply banned from the British market. So it led to quite a sense of drama within Australia. There are all sorts of political implications of that as well. You know, Australians feeling let down, and particularly my parents' generation, for reasons that I think would be pretty obvious to you. So we had to think what we were going to do next. I mean, we simply lost markets, and we literally lost them overnight on the 1st of January 1973. And that led to substantial reorientation of our trade policy. And as our Deputy Prime Minister was saying only yesterday to Liam Fox, in a sense it was a blessing in disguise, because instead of just being heavily dependent on one market, we decided to think about other markets, find new markets, invest heavily in accessing those new markets, and that opened up a cornucopia of markets for us in Asia, which now completely dominate our trade. So what do I mean by all of this? I mean, I think the lesson is I've sat in cabinets and heard we call him the Treasurer, the Chancellor equivalent, come along with Treasury documents filled with Treasury assumptions. And obviously assumptions, forecasts and predictions. And obviously those forecasts depend entirely on the assumptions that you make. And many of our Treasury forecasts have been wrong. Sometimes overestimates, sometimes underestimates. And as the Treasury says when you say to them, but last year you told us this and you were wrong. Well, Minister, it was just a forecast. We don't actually know what's going to happen in the future. And that's fair enough. They wouldn't be working in the Treasury if they could foresee the future. They'd be in the markets making huge amounts of money instead of, $60,000 a year working as a junior Treasury officer. Says something about Australian wages, that. I would quote the current Secretary of our Treasury, a man called John Fraser, who says that in the end, you have to be an intuitive economist. You have to back your own intuition. What do you really think will happen? So let's just move all of that to the Brexit issue. We offer no advice and do not wish, as the Australian government, to get involved in your debates, excepting to say this. It's pretty obvious to us as outsiders that if you remain in the customs union, there are certain advantages that would flow from that, particularly for businesses which have supply chains into and out of Europe. Obviously, if you leave, I mean, it's true that the average tariff rate of the European Union under the WTO schedules is around 4.2%. But there are a whole lot of areas where there is no tariff at all, and there are other areas, as one of you said, in relation to particularly agriculture, where tariffs can be anything up to 80 or 90%. So it varies a bit. So in some areas, if you leave the customs union, then that's going to be prima facie a difficulty for those particular industries which confront those very high tariffs. On the other hand, if you stay in the customs union, there are some substantial downsides, and for we Australians, we would say this to you with a degree of emphasis. If you leave the customs union, you will be able to negotiate a whole range of new trade agreements with other parts of the world. And so you will be able to open up markets for yourselves, just as we did after 1973, in ways, let me put it to you, in ways that are difficult to forecast and are hard to imagine. That is exactly what happened to us. We thought we were doing well with Japan, but we never thought we would open up the markets we opened up in places like, for example, well, most importantly, China or Korea or Taiwan. We never thought those markets would open up in the way they eventually did back at that time. So in a sense, if you leave the customs union, so I'm not advocating one or the other here, you've got that message, haven't you? I've made the point about the supply chains and the advantage of staying in the customs union. It's quite well done, this, isn't it?
You should be a diplomat.
Well, I need a bit more training to get that quite right. I spent too long in politics, I think. But if you leave the customs union, you can make free trade agreements with countries that you guess, I think, in the short term are relatively easy to do free trade agreements with, and then start building out from there. For you as one country, as distinct from 28 in the EU, I suspect it will be a little easier for you to do free trade agreements than it might be for the EU as a whole to do free trade agreements. Now, that is based also on an assumption. That is based on the assumption that you don't want to protect a whole raft of different industries here in the UK. That you subscribe to the notion that you want an open and free economy, which is an economy which will be ever-changing. And, you know, there's the destructive power of capitalism. You don't want to cling on to particular sectors or particular industries for the sake of hanging on to them, that you accept that the nature of your economy is constantly going to change. And that's what we've done in Australia. We've pretty much stripped away all of our tariffs. We have, and quotas. We used to have a lot of tariffs and quotas. We used to protect our motor vehicle industry. In October this year, so only a few months to go now, the last car will roll off the production line in Australia, never to build another car again. All of our cars are imported. And you might think, well, gosh, isn't that horrific? The whole country. No, it's okay. We've had 26 years of continuous economic growth. And we have just seen our whole economy reorient and change its direction. So one of the problems with making forecasts is that you make assumptions about the structure of your economy remaining pretty much the same. But if you change if you like, the architecture of your economy, negotiate free trade agreements elsewhere and so on, it will in itself change the structure of your economy. Your trading patterns will change, your investment patterns will change, and in a sense you don't quite know how they're going to change. So I think, you know, you have an interesting choice here as to whether you really work to try to maintain the current supply chains that you have, or whether you're going to take a view that you should pretty much open up your economy to the rest of the world. Now, let me just finish by saying that a lot of people say free trade agreements are incredibly difficult to do. It took the European Union 7 years to negotiate CETA, the free trade or the trade agreement with, not exactly a free trade agreement, but the trade agreement with Canada. These are complex matters, and it will take Britain years and years and years to negotiate these things. I just say to you, that depends. That depends what you want to protect, what carve-outs you want from trade agreements. In the last 12 years, Australia has negotiated 8 free trade agreements. 8 in the last 12 years. We negotiated a free trade agreement with the United States in 2005-06. It took up... No, it's not. It's later than that. 2005-06.
Sorry, Minister.
Geoff was the WTO ambassador at the time. That took us 15 months to negotiate with the United States. Why? Because basically we just wanted, the leaders of our countries just decided we wanted to open up free trade. There are a couple of carve-outs. For example, we still can't sell much sugar into the United States. There are some regulatory issues that we had to manage. But we did that at the same time negotiating other free trade agreements. Do we use a lot of officials? Do we have a huge department to do this? We have, at the moment, in our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which does these negotiations, 130 people who work on trade negotiations. So obviously they liaise with other departments, agriculture, communications, the Treasury, and so on. Yes, of course they do. But you don't need huge numbers of people to do it. But you need to have a mindset that you are a free trading country. That is axiomatic. If your mindset is you want to protect the beef industry with tariffs, or you want to protect the sheep meat industry, or the car industry with tariffs, or whatever you want to do, i.e. making those products all much more expensive for your own consumers, particularly low-income consumers. But if you want to do that, then not only will you penalise low-income earners, but you will make it much more difficult to negotiate trade agreements. With the EU, we say this to the UK and to the EU. At the moment, the international debate on free trade is a bit under pressure, and I think you're all aware of that. The last thing we need at this time in history is for the European Union and the United Kingdom to erect tariff barriers between each other. We see that as inimical to global economic growth. It will damage growth in this country, but it will damage growth in the EU, and it will damage global economic growth, and it will damage the international argument for trade liberalisation. At the moment, you do have free trade with the EU. We'd like to see that continue, however you negotiate that. But from our point of view, our very selfish point of view, we'd like you also to be, as the Prime Minister here says, a flag waver for free trade and go out and negotiate free trade agreements with other countries. And we think that could be pretty beneficial. It's worked for us.
Thank you very much indeed. Nicky was very game to help us this morning, and I know that you're under some time pressure. So if she suddenly ups and outs, don't be put off. It's because she's got to go somewhere else. So thank you very much.
No, well, thank you very much. And yes, it's not that I don't want to answer questions. I think I'm here to provide a necessary balance for the panel. And I think really, Alexander, where you left off is a good place to start, because actually I think the debate we've heard this morning and the paper really encapsulates the debate and the tone of the debate for the past year, which is this debate between head versus heart. And actually, you're absolutely right. If we are going to go down this route of leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, then we have got to become a nation that really embraces free trade, that understands free trade. And it was mentioned at the start, I'm a lawyer. So on one hand, putting aside my own personal views on the whole Brexit debate, new agreements, new negotiations are something that's quite exciting. And it's always a challenge to see, when you get instructions from a client, how well you can handle negotiations and where you're going to end up. But I also look at this as a constituency member of Parliament. And I take the point that the authors of the report said this is a small issue in economic terms, but it could be a very large issue in political terms, and it could be a particularly large issue for the Conservative Party. And in the conclusion to the report, which is, very, very interesting, it does talk about the impact of Brexit being on GDP being negative, although that being small. And of course, it talks about saying Brexit will be disruptive. There will be new border controls with paperwork and potential delays. And of course, there's issues of lower migration, which will also impact on GDP. Now, that's not the purpose of this report, but I think just to look at trade and Treasury forecasts, and I've been a Treasury Minister, you're absolutely right, those who said a forecast is a forecast, it's not set in stone, and you can go overboard either way in interpreting a forecast. But I do know as a constituency member of Parliament that my SMEs have got to get their heads round a whole new trade policy, new export markets under new conditions. And we already know, and I spent time when I was in government hearing the fact that we have a trade deficit. We import far more than we export, and many of our businesses are not great at exporting. And if we are going to encourage them to find new markets, we are going to have to completely revamp, for example, UKTI, because I still get far too many complaints from constituency companies that they are not getting the support to exploit and find new markets. And that can be very straightforward support. Things like languages help as much as it is about negotiating agreements. I don't want to repeat all the comments that have been made this morning, but I think it's interesting that this report is launched today when there's news that the Trump administration is thinking about how they might start up discussions again about TTIP with the European Union after the German elections in the autumn. The mention made, obviously, a lot of our exports, it's not just goods, it's about services too, and it's not just about tariffs, it's about regulatory barriers. And I take the point that we start from a position where we have the same regulations as our European Union counterparts at the moment. The question is going to be, of course, how they develop, and there are ways we can take advantage of not being part of that. But there will be other sectors, and again, it goes back to the point about the emotional connection with developing a free trading nation. We have to encourage people not to want to be either protectionist or to develop regulations that won't help us, our businesses, to export around the world. My understanding of the WTO option, and there is an emotional thing about, there is a worry about a cliff edge, there's a worry about needing transition, and I think I also welcome news that the Prime Minister is setting up a business council of big business organisations and small, people like the FSB as well, to really get the voice of business, to understand. That's something that Greg Clark has called for, and I think it's absolutely welcome, because we're going to have to take, as a government, business with us if we are going to embark on this new era of totally free trade. We've also got the issue around customs union, around the Northern Ireland, the border with the Republic as well, and how that is going to be resolved, the issues around paperwork, and simple things like having the IT systems in place in order to be able to process goods across borders without having undue delays, which consumers will not thank us for, including if that leads to price rises and potential shortages. So yes, of course, we can look at the report, we can understand that the modelling may not turn out to be correct, but it's a lot more than just about trade. The whole issue about leaving the European Union, the impact, the wider impact on business, of issues around migration policy, issues around recruitment, and issues around changing the mindset of our businesses across this country in order to embrace these new opportunities. And that's going to take time. It's going to take time. I think those who believe that the sunlit uplands are within grasp within the next 21 months are going to have to revisit those assumptions because I don't think it's going to be as easy. It might not be impossible, but it's not going to be as easy as some would forecast. And it's going to be down to the politicians, not the civil servants in the Treasury, not those who are looking at trade policy and writing reports, but it's going down to politicians and grassroots politicians in our constituencies to break that news to local businesses about the decisions that have been taken at a much higher level. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm conscious this has been a very dense and heavy discussion, inevitably so, because it is quite complex. And I want to actually throw it open to questions. I'm going to ask you to state your name and organisation, and I take the question now.
Yes, my name's Martin Powell. I'm chairman of Lawyers for Britain. And I want to just make a comment from a legal perspective. From a legal perspective, I'm not sort of qualified to comment on gravity models and so on we've heard so much about. But it seems to me we have to be very careful about our sense of priorities. And at the moment, already the majority of our international trade is outside the European Union rather than inside it. What's more, it is growing a lot faster over the last 15 years than the trade inside the European Union. Therefore, looking forward long term, it is more, although our getting the right deal with the European Union is important, it is less important overall than our future ability to trade outside the European Union. Therefore, what we must avoid at all costs is lock-in. That is, provisions in and a deal with the European Union that lock us in and interfere with our external trade.
Yeah, I'm going to take two more in a group. Yeah. So I'm going to take the gentleman there.
Brett of Builders Merchants Federation, a major supply chain ambassador. We buy manufactured and raw materials from all over the world, as you might imagine. So, for example, timber from Sweden, Latvia, Finland, and so on. The worry for our industry is that the authorities are not prepared for this. So my question is, do the panel think, and Nicky Morgan flirted with the suggestion, has the HMRC got a big enough computer for hundreds of millions of more e-customs declarations? Payments of VAT, because VAT is a European tax which we will no longer be paying. And much more importantly, the emotional argument is Operation Stack in Dover, of motorways being covered by lorries that can't be processed at the port authorities. We will have that all along the East Coast because the preparation is not ready at Harwich, Felixstowe and so on.
Now I'm going to take a question right at the back with the man with the white shirt. So.
Thank you. My name's Josh Cameron. I'm at FTI, formerly a trade advisor in the Prime Minister of New Zealand's office. So a lot of the discussion today has been around openness and what can be achieved with that, which is correct. But we've seen yesterday the government commit to agricultural subsidies as part of the DUP deal. We've seen the government also subsidise Nissan in some way. Is there any indication that there's a political will or political capacity to actually open up your economy and get rid of farm welfare and those kind of things that will stop you from getting free trade agreements?
Very good. Well, I know that Nicky's got to make a move, so I'll make sure she has full opportunity. If you're game to
yes.
Kick off. Yep.
Well, thank you. Well, look, I think the second question, and you're right. I mean, I'm not in government. I'm not privy to the discussions that are going on, of which I'm sure there are many. But we all know that government IT procurement and systems and expansion is not terribly easily completed, if I can put it that way. And I do think that there is going to come a point in all of this process, and for the record, I accept that this country is going to no longer be a member of the European Union after March 2019. But there will come a point when the hard reality comes up against what people are saying, and let's hope there isn't an Operation Stack on the East Coast. But I take the point that you have made, and I think in a way that's captured by the question at the back as well, which is, and I think this is the point about needing to change the mindset of people in this country, and many of whom are in business now. If you're under the age of 44, 45, then actually you are very used to what you know is being in the European Union. And so those in business, those setting out business, are going to have to change a mindset to something very different, to true openness. And I have to say, from my constituency point of view, when I go and see my farmers, the question is, are my payments continuing? And Peter will say, well, actually, we're not going to be sending money to the EU, so there's more money. But I think what you're getting at is actually wanting to change that whole mindset completely. And I'll leave the other question, I think.
Yeah. Just on this point about the horrendous image of customs bank up and so on the East Coast. Nicky touched on that point as well. That's why you need to do a free trade agreement with the EU as quickly as possible. If you have zero tariffs between the UK and the EU, there is no customs issue. It is as it is today. And that goes to a number of the issues that are being raised now. If there's no tariffs, there's no tariffs. But storage is another issue. There are no customs duties to collect, so there's free trade. It's the current situation. It doesn't change. So that's why you need to get on and negotiate the FTA with the EU as quickly as possible. And to the point about subsidies and so on, I think, and hopefully the pressure of having to negotiate an FTA will start to roll over some of those interest groups that may be pushing for subsidies and special privileges, because an FTA with the EU is paramount, and the way to do that is for the UK, as the High Commissioner said, adopt a mindset of openness and liberalisation.
Right, I'm going to do another round of three. So there's one question there.
Thank you. Owen Bennett from HuffPost UK. I just wanted a quick word from the panel, particularly from...
Sorry, could you come again?
Owen Bennett from HuffPost UK. Quick word from the panel, particularly the High Commissioner. It sounds like that you guys are really strongly warning against no deal and against Britain leaving on WTO terms. I wonder if you could like to say what you think the impact that would be in trying to secure other free trade deals. And also to Nicky, has there been much cross-party working between people like yourself and other Labour MPs?
We're going to do one question at a time. So you've had your question. There's a lady whose hand I see at the back.
Hi, Lauren McKevitt from Morpeth Consulting. I do trade policy in East Africa. One of the big issues around the referendum last year that I found was not talked about enough is the fact that the United Kingdom, through the European Union as well as through our domestic policy, pays an enormous amount in foreign aid to places like East Africa. And large amounts of the problems that we have in the European partnership agreements in the region are that they're based around French agricultural requirements and not trade policy that the United Kingdom may put forward themselves. My concern with the current conversation on customs union is that we may never get around to addressing that particular problem. We may continue to hand out aid to areas where actually trade would be far better, but we are precluded because of negotiations that we ourselves have not managed to win the argument on, such as the ones around agriculture.
Thank you very much. There's a question at the front as well. Can you just remind us of name and organisation and audibly?
John Ashmore, Politics Home, again for Nicky. You said you're happy with, well, not happy, you accept that we're leaving, but to what extent do you accept the version of Brexit that Theresa May set out in her Lancaster House speech? And are you doing any work with other MPs from any parties on kind of tempering that version?
Very good.
Shall I answer that? I've got to go. Yeah. Okay, well, look, thank you very much. Look, I think that the election result is being interpreted in all sorts of different ways. But I do think that some of the decisions taken in the Lancaster House speech and since, it'll be very interesting to see what the will of Parliament is. And I think what happens when you have an inconclusive election result like the one we've had, actually the views on the floor of Parliament become ever more important. And I'm aware of other MPs, obviously in my party and in other parties, who, and you can see from some of the amendments going down to the Queen's Speech where other MPs are. I have no doubt at all the Queen's Speech will be passed unamended in full by Conservative and MPs with the support of the DUP. But I think there's a much broader argument, and I think the question from Lauren about trade policy, I mean, I think there's lots of things that weren't discussed last year, and there's lots of things that have now got to come out, and I think I would say that the Conservative Party very much obviously believes in the principles of trade, and there was talk the other day about the free trade for trade with developing, or reducing the access, the barriers, trade with developing countries, which I think is a very important start to this debate. But I think we're only beginning to have these debates now, and how it's actually going to work, and that's what's being reflected back from MPs across the House in terms of what we're getting back from our constituents.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah.
Do you want to comment quickly?
Nicky's finished. Yes, on the election result, it was a dreadful election result for Theresa May. It was a very bad election result for the Conservative Party, but it actually means we now have Parliament, more than 80% of whose the voters for which voted for parties who are committed to leaving the European Union and to ending freedom of movement and therefore leaving the single market or the European Economic Area and are committed to negotiating trade deals with the rest of the world and therefore are committed to leaving the customs union. So actually there's a degree of unanimity in this country in Parliament. The three parties who didn't do that all lost market share. Three parties who said they wanted another referendum with the option of remaining in all lost market share. And shares of the vote, I mean.
We're not traded yet.
Getting back into the private sector.
We understand what you mean.
So that actually we ought to be going as a nation and saying to the Europeans, we all want continuing free trade with you, with Europe, with a minimum of non-tariff barriers. We believe it's in your interests as well as ours, economically. If they agree, there'll be such an agreement, and that's good. If they don't, for political reasons, if they think they've got to scare their own voters from voting for Eurosceptic parties, and therefore insist on imposing tariffs on us, that's a second-best solution. But it's not a disastrous solution, and that's what the analysis that the study shows and the evidence from New Zealand and Australia shows, that it would be best to continue with free trade. It would be simple to continue with free trade, because to go from zero tariffs to zero tariffs takes only 10 minutes to negotiate. And to go from identical regulations to identical regulations, all you have to negotiate, and it's important, it's an element of most free trade deals, is what happens if there's subsequent divergence. You have to have a divergence mechanism. That may take weeks to negotiate. But we start where all other trade negotiations end up. Yes. And that's why it's so much simpler. It's beneficial. I suspect it's less likely to happen than most people think, because I think politics may override economics.
Yeah.
Just a quick one on WTO. There is no cliff. We've heard, I think, almost uniformly across the panel that if you end up doing it just on WTO grounds, which I suspect not, because what we're just hearing, it's quite easy to do an FTA between the UK and the EU. You could do a lot worse with average tariffs of 4% in the WTO by the EU.
I just want to, because it was put to me, this question of no deal. It reminds me that I have watched as an outsider with great interest this debate about the Prime Minister saying no deal is better than a bad deal. I must say I would have thought that was an obvious position to take in a negotiation. Yes. I wouldn't turn up to a negotiation saying, by the way, my position is I'd rather a bad deal with you than no deal at all, because my interlocutor would then table a really bad deal, and I'd look at it and, you know, some Anglo-Saxon oath as I looked at it and said, that is just a shocking deal. And they said, well, mate, you either take that or there's no deal, because you said that's what you'd prefer. So I think myself, you know, I don't want to sound too much as I'm supporting the British government here, but I work with them. I would have thought their position that no deal is better than a bad deal is slightly obvious. But I think what we as outsiders would be interested in would be seeing, in the event of there being no deal, what you would do. So, for example, there are things you can do and things you can't do. You can't do anything about the EU's WTO schedules. You will be subjected to those. But what would you do? Would you impose tariffs on EU exports to the UK, or wouldn't you? And that would have some macroeconomic effect on this country. I mean, it sounds a bit self-serving for an Australian to say this, but I personally think you might be, and it's not the Australian government's view, you might be better off having no tariffs on EU exports to the UK, even if they put tariffs on your exports to the EU, because that would...
We have to do the same for the rest of the world.
And I was about to say, I told you I was self-serving. I told you I was yeah, but by the way, that might be a huge macroeconomic change in this country. You know, it would be quite an interesting thing to do. So my only point here is that if in this negotiation, we would be very interested to see what no deal actually looks like, because that's your base position. And do I think you'll get a deal? I'm impressed by the optimism you have about the EU seeing common sense and so on, but their project is not just about economics. And I think people often forget that. Their project is as much a political project. In fact, I'd put it to you, is more of a political project than an economic project. And that will affect your capacity to negotiate with them. That's why you better have a look at what no deal might look like, because it might happen.
I'm going to do one very quick round of quick questions of anyone who's desperate to ask a question. So anyone, or can we all go home? Seriously, is anyone, gentleman there? Wait for the microphone, explain who you are.
Hi, Guy Thomas.
Quick question.
Two quick questions.
No, one quick question.
One quick question. Britain has to reintegrate itself as an independent member of the WTO. Can this work? Can this work? Given that there will be pitfalls, and should we do a trade deal with America?
Thank you very much indeed, and I know he's going to answer that question. Is there any other question to go with it? Someone wants to ask quickly. Good. Dr. Raby.
Just two quick yeses to those questions. I mean, the UK is a member of the WTO in its own right already. What it doesn't have is its own schedule for goods and its own schedule for services. That's the EU schedule. It will have to introduce a new schedule and negotiate that amongst WTO partners. But I think you'll find that the existing schedules will apply until such time as a new schedule has been negotiated. Like the EU 23 schedule is the one that applies for the EU 28 today, until a new one's adopted. That's a technical matter, and also the US, yes, have a go at an FTA with the US.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming here. I always say that we can't organise events like this unless people are game to come and speak and help us do it, and also that you're game to come as an audience and to interrogate our speakers and help us to put these things together. So thank you very much all for coming here today. Policy Exchange is doing a lot of work on this big question of what happens if we can't reach agreement. What would the world look like? What is the capacity of customs and excise to actually handle all the IT things? Would it be so bad to have to trade on WTO terms, or maybe do something more adventurous? And certainly, I increasingly find as I examine these issues, when it comes to the fundamentals of free trade and a completely open, liberal system, I'm reminded of the famous exchange that took place between Sir Robert Peel and William Gladstone on the Treasury bench in the 1840s, where Sir Robert was invited to defend the tariffs that protected agriculture. And he listened to the intellectual argument being put up against, and he turned to Gladstone and said, "You will have to answer this because I cannot." And it does seem to me that the more one goes into it, the case for a wholly liberal integration of the United Kingdom economy in all world markets for agriculture and manufacturing and services should be the direction of travel that we actually go in. And it will also mean that if there is any awkwardness at the point of departure, there won't be frictions and transaction costs that we erect around here. But this is a big, complex debate. We're very conscious at Policy Exchange that there's more than one answer to these questions. Economists made complete clots of themselves in 2007, 2008, and I think my profession didn't do quite so well this time last year. And we're conscious that these are highly contested matters. We want to promote that debate. We want to scrutinise that debate and help to stimulate it. So thank you very much for coming. And I really do thank all our guests today from the bottom of my heart for being here to help us with it. Thank you very much indeed.